Reciprocal licensing refers to an agreement between states where they recognize each other's professional licenses. In other words, if one has a valid professional license in one state and its state has a reciprocity agreement with another state, one may be able to obtain a license in the second state without having to go through the full licensing process, such as taking another examination. Instead of obtaining a completely new license, one typically obtains a reciprocal license. The reciprocal license acknowledges that the qualifications and standards met in the original state are substantially equivalent to those required in the second state. The exact requirements for obtaining a reciprocal license vary by profession and by state. However, some common requirements include holding a valid license in good standing in the original state, meeting certain experience requirements, paying an application fee, and undergoing a background check. Some states may also require one to take a jurisprudence exam, which tests one's knowledge of the laws and regulations specific to that state. The benefits of reciprocal licensing include reduced costs and time associated with obtaining a license in a new state, increased mobility for professionals, and a more streamlined licensing process. To determine if one state reciprocates with another, one should check with the licensing board or agency in the state where one seeks to obtain a license. They can provide information on which states they have reciprocity agreements with and the specific requirements for obtaining a reciprocal license. It is important to note that not all states have reciprocity agreements for all professions. Some states may only have reciprocity agreements with certain states or for certain professions. Therefore, it is essential to verify the specific requirements before applying for a reciprocal license. In summary, if one state reciprocates with another, one typically obtains a reciprocal license, not a new license. The reciprocal license allows one to practice one's profession in the second state without having to go through the full licensing process. Firstly, one must confirm that reciprocity exists. Secondly, one needs to determine the exact requirements for reciprocity. Thirdly, it is important to complete the application process and pay the required fees. The concept of reciprocal licensing is designed to facilitate interstate practice for licensed professionals, reducing redundant hurdles and fostering greater professional mobility across state lines. It recognizes that fundamental qualifications and competencies are often standardized across different jurisdictions. One should always consult the relevant state licensing boards for the most current and precise information. The process generally involves submitting an application, providing proof of licensure in good standing from the original state, and potentially undergoing a criminal background check. In certain professions, a jurisprudence exam may be necessary to ensure familiarity with local laws and regulations. The application review may also involve an assessment of educational credentials and work experience to ensure substantial equivalency with the licensing requirements of the reciprocal state. The specific criteria and procedures can vary significantly depending on the profession and the states involved. It's crucial to proactively gather all necessary documentation and understand the potential timelines involved in the application process. Some states may also require verification of continuing education or professional development activities to ensure that the licensee has maintained current knowledge and skills in their field. Furthermore, some reciprocity agreements may have specific limitations or conditions, such as restrictions on the scope of practice or requirements for supervision. Therefore, a thorough understanding of the terms of the reciprocity agreement is essential. The benefits of reciprocal licensing extend beyond individual practitioners. It also facilitates the provision of professional services across state lines, which can be particularly important in industries where there is a shortage of qualified professionals or where specialized expertise is needed. Moreover, reciprocal licensing promotes greater standardization and consistency in professional standards across different jurisdictions, which can enhance public safety and consumer protection. The concept of reciprocity is rooted in the principles of mutual recognition and cooperation between states. It acknowledges that licensing standards are often aligned across different jurisdictions and that licensed professionals in one state are generally qualified to practice in another state with similar standards. However, it's important to recognize that reciprocity is not automatic. States retain the authority to establish their own licensing requirements and to determine whether or not to enter into reciprocity agreements with other states. The decision to grant reciprocity is typically based on an assessment of the equivalency of licensing standards and the potential impact on public safety and consumer protection. In some cases, states may have partial reciprocity agreements, which means that they only recognize licenses from certain states or for certain professions. It's also possible for states to suspend or terminate reciprocity agreements if they determine that the licensing standards in another state are no longer adequate. Therefore, it's crucial to stay informed about any changes or updates to reciprocity agreements. In addition to reciprocal licensing, some states may also offer endorsement, which is a similar process that allows licensed professionals to obtain a license in a new state based on their existing qualifications. Endorsement typically involves a review of the applicant's credentials and experience to determine if they meet the licensing requirements of the new state. The requirements for endorsement may be different from those for reciprocity, so it's important to understand the specific criteria for each option. Furthermore, some states may participate in interstate compacts, which are agreements between states that streamline the licensing process for certain professions. Interstate compacts typically establish uniform licensing standards and procedures, which make it easier for licensed professionals to practice in multiple states. Firstly, you should always verify if an interstate compact exists for your particular profession. Secondly, you must find out if the states you are interested in participating in are involved in such a compact. Thirdly, you must research the specific requirements and procedures of the interstate compact. Reciprocal licensing, endorsement, and interstate compacts are all important mechanisms for promoting professional mobility and ensuring that qualified professionals can provide services across state lines. However, it's essential to understand the specific requirements and procedures for each option and to stay informed about any changes or updates to licensing laws and regulations. By proactively researching and understanding the licensing requirements in different states, licensed professionals can avoid unnecessary delays and costs and can ensure that they are able to practice their profession wherever they are needed. It's also important to remember that licensing laws and regulations can change over time, so it's essential to stay up to date on the latest developments. Professional associations and licensing boards are valuable resources for staying informed about licensing requirements and reciprocity agreements. The application process typically includes submitting an application form, providing transcripts or other documentation of education and training, providing proof of licensure in good standing from the original state, and paying an application fee. Some states may also require applicants to undergo a criminal background check or to take a jurisprudence exam. The review process can take several weeks or even months, depending on the state and the profession. It's important to be patient and to respond promptly to any requests for additional information from the licensing board. Once the application is approved, the applicant will typically receive a reciprocal license, which allows them to practice their profession in the new state. The reciprocal license may be subject to certain conditions or limitations, such as restrictions on the scope of practice or requirements for supervision. It's important to carefully review the terms of the reciprocal license to ensure that one is in compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. Furthermore, the licensee must continue to maintain the license in good standing by complying with all applicable laws and regulations, including continuing education requirements. Failure to comply with these requirements can result in disciplinary action, such as suspension or revocation of the license.